Good morning, everybody. My name is Esbeidy Torres, and today I'll be discussing the evolving cinematic depiction of school shooters in American films. Now, films play an essential role in the establishment of myths, but more dangerously, the establishment of martyrs. This was especially well known to the Columbine shooters, so much so that in one of their basement tapes, they went on to argue that directors would be fighting over their story. They went on to debate as to whether the famed directors Steven Spielberg or Quentin Tarantino could make the better movie out of the 1999 Columbine Massacre. Regardless of who spearheaded this project, they knew it would include a lot of foreshadowing and dramatic irony. And this is exactly what they got. The media faced a lot of criticism for its portrayal of the Columbine shooters after the attack, and I wanted to see if similar scrutiny was faced with how we deal with the film industry. Thus leading to my research question, namely, how do Gus Van Sant's Elephant, Lynn Ramsey's We Need to Talk About Kevin, and Megan Park's The Fallout reflect the evolving portrayal of attackers in the American school shooter films. Now, much of our contemporary understanding of school shootings come from the works of criminologist Adam Langford. He pioneered a lot of the research in terms of the motivations behind school shooters. He argues that fame-seeking is one of the primary motivators behind violence in the modern era because of the incentives of fame. Unfortunately, the media tends to provide a lot of this glamour to attackers that provide higher victim rates. And it's almost guaranteed that their name and face will be spattered all across the country, sometimes even the world. And because of this, Adam Langford paired up with another criminologist by the name of Eric Madfis to create what is known as the Don't Name Them, Don't Show Them policy. Established in 2017, this aims to encourage the media to remove the photograph, name, and likeness of past and present perpetrators, opting instead to report on every other aspect of the crime. And I utilized this to see if it was reflected in the movies that I selected, which I analyzed using Jason Silva's qualitative content framework, which essentially juxtaposes academic knowledge with cinematic fiction. I looked at my 3 films to see how each of them characterized the perpetrators, victims, and social factors within them, and using Langford's works as well to determine whether fame-seeking acted as a primary motivator for the characters in these movies. And the first one we're going to analyze today is Gus Van Sant's Elephant from 2003. This movie came shortly after the 1999 Columbine Massacre and draws a lot of its inspiration from that attack. Although we do get to see it from the perspective of the victims at some points, the central focus of this narrative is the perpetrators and the attack which takes place at the climax of this movie. The director relies heavily on the stereotypes and school shooter profiles. He characterizes the 2 attackers as white males who are sexually frustrated, spend a lot of time alone, play violent video games, they're obsessed with guns. At one point, we also see them absorbing Nazi propaganda. And because of all of these different constructs, we get that very stereotypical, often biased view of school shooters. We even see that in their attire, as it is reflective of followers of the Columbine shooters known as the trench coat mafia. But I really want to draw your attention to this scene right here when they're actually entering the campus. Interestingly enough, a lot of these have parallels to CCTV footage collected from Columbine after the attack. But this particular interaction right here brings forth a lot of questions. We see that before the attack takes place, one of the students runs into them and raises their camera to take a photo of them. And full disclosure, the next clips that we'll see in this presentation do include bits of violence, but if we continue watching, we'll see that the attack only begins after their image has been captured and essentially immortalizing the 2 attackers, giving them that incentive, that sense of martyrdom. And although this is only briefly discussed in our first movie, it is the central focus of our second, namely, We Need to Talk About Kevin from 2011 by Lynn Ramsey. This movie is very similar in respect to Elephant because we do get to see the perpetrator by the name of Kevin as the main character, as well as the shooting remains the central focus of the narrative. We introduce victims into this because it's narrated from Kevin's mother's perspective, Ava, and her troubles and tribulations trying to raise her troubled son. However, this movie is very, very open in how it discusses fame as a motivation. We see the perpetrator, before the attack takes place, welcoming the sounds of the police sirens, the screams, the chants that he expects from the people when they're going to enter into this building. However, Elephant relied very heavily on its graphic violence in order to get its point across. But this is not necessarily the case in this movie. Rather than seeing the actual attack, we get to see Kevin as he goes on and engages in this massacre, looking at his reflections in his image. And by doing this, we only ever get to see the victims as their bodies are being removed from the canvas. Making this decision in terms of directing of this film allows us to glamorize the attacker at the central narrative and not giving as much attention to the people who are involved in this attack as well as the survivors of it. This is also the only movie of the three in which the character directly addresses to the audience this idea of fame as a motivation. Because shortly after this attack takes place, Kevin gets arrested, and while he's arrested, he conducts an interview which he releases to the media. He criticizes people at home, claiming that as long as there's people out there watching people like him, there will continue to be an incentive for violence. Because these attackers can rely on the fact that people are interested in this and the questions of trying to understand why it happens. And as long as that incentive remains, they'll continue to conduct these attacks. However, we take a complete 180 in our last film, namely Megan Park's The Fallout from 2021. And it's also two important points about this. First, it came shortly after the Stoneman Douglas shooting in Parkland, Florida from 2018. It's also the only one of the three films which came after the don't name them, don't show them policy. And this is reflected, both of these elements, within the movie itself. Unfortunately, a lot of academic discourse, whenever we do discuss school shootings, they see victim rates as merely a consequence of crime and deviance or something sensationalized that they can throw into news articles and get people's attention. But films do something more interesting, as it allows us to really connect with the characters and empathize with their situations. In this movie, the attack takes place within the first 15 minutes because its focus is the aftermath, what happens after the shooting occurs. This is the only thing we ever get to see of this attack. We get to hear the police activity, the gunshots in the background, but we never actually see the violence. Instead, we see these three survivors from the high school as they're navigating these feelings of loss, mourning, fear, as they're trying to come to terms with the attack that they just survived. We get to explore their psychological consequences that came after this. We get to understand the political factors at the time because it discusses this idea that school shootings continue to be a problem that plague our society. Interestingly though, because this came after the don't name them, don't show them policy, we never get to see the face or the likeness of the attacker in the media's portrayals reporting after the fact. We do get to hear the name of the perpetrator twice, but it's only discussed in conversation, never in the actual media portrayals. This showing that interesting shift in where academia has begun to influence cinematic depictions. But overall, all of these three films reflect that new change within the film industry in which all of our projects are starting to get more influence from the scholarly conversations going on in society. Although it was not directed by Spielberg or Tarantino, Elephant is everything that the Columbine shooters ever wanted because it glamorizes the attackers by placing them as the central focus of the narrative. And although this continues to be the case in We Need to Talk About Kevin, we do get to see the introduction of victims into the story, as we get to hear about Ava's struggles raising her son. However, it falls short in the fact that there's victim blaming involved, as the movie is framed in a way that it makes the audience want to say that Ava is at least partially responsible for raising a psychopathic son. However, movies like The Fallout show a complete change in our new understanding and discussion of school shootings within popular culture because of this idea of removing the photo and likeness, de-glamorizing them even within films, thus taking away that incentive that the Columbine shooters sought for before conducting their massacre in '99. And also this idea of introducing politics, introducing advocacy, as some of the students within this movie go on to create their own movement, anti-gun movement, similar to that we saw during the Never Again after Stoneman Douglas. However, all three of these movies provide a uniquely American approach to the school shooting discussion. So for future research, scholars can look at international films and look at how different cultures go about portraying these ideas of violence and how they go about depicting perpetrators within their movies. But ultimately, we can expect to see more works like The Fallout in incoming years, given that fact, the recency of this don't name them, don't show them policy. And we already saw how it was very useful during the Uvalde shooting, as we got to see the desensitization of the attackers. And hopefully we'll get to see other movies in which academic discourse is introduced to adapt our understanding through popular culture. Here are my references, and thank you.